My name is David Brigham. I'm the librarian and CEO of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, Nicholas Biddle and the Bank Wars, live streamed from Andalusia. HSP was founded in 1824 and proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History. Our collections contain over 21 million manuscripts that hold stories of all Americans with a particular emphasis on early American history, ethnic and minority groups, science and industry, the arts, and genealogical resources. Our collaboration this evening with Andalusia is a special pleasure since among our treasures are the Biddle family papers across many generations. A few housekeeping notes. We have closed captioning tonight, so hit the CC button if you would like to benefit from that option. We are recording tonight's program, and it will be sent to you in a link in a follow-up email. We will also have time for questions at the end. If you'd like to put some questions in the Q&A, please do. And our colleague, Justina Barrett, will be moderating that discussion at the end. Please let us know in the chat where you're Zooming from so that we can all say hello to one another. We are in webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. If you would like to ask a question, you may use the raised hand feature on your Zoom toolbar, or again, drop a question in the chat or the Q&A. We're delighted to welcome our host, John Vick, and Cordelia Biddle, our speaker this evening. Cordelia Frances Biddle is an independent historian and author. Her nonfiction works include Biddle, Jackson, and A Nation in Turmoil, the infamous bank war, which I have here and highly recommend. Cordelia, thank you for this book. It's really illuminating. She has also written St. Catherine, the Life of Catherine Drexel, as well as a number of historical fiction books, including Sins of Commission, The Actress, Without Fear, Deception's Daughter, and The Conjurer. Cordelia Biddle has taught creative writing at Drexel University's Pennoni Honors College since 2008. She is the recipient of the 2021 Drexel University Adjunct Teaching Excellence Award. She received the Pennoni Honors College Award in 2012. John Vick is the Director of Collections, Interpretation, and Engagement at Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum. Before coming to Andalusia in 2022, Mr. Vick spent 13 years at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, curating and contributing to over 20 exhibitions and books on a range of topics, from Marcel Duchamp to historical African art. His final project there was managing the creation of new galleries of early American art, a component of the core project designed by architect Frank Gehry. He holds a bachelor's degree from Boston College and a master's from the University of Pennsylvania, both in the history of art. We're delighted to live stream this conversation from the library at Andalusia. Tonight, Cordelia and John will be discussing Cordelia's work in the Biddle family papers, both at HSP and at Andalusia. Again, we'll have time at the end for your questions, so please go ahead and put them in the Q&A bar. And it's my pleasure now to turn the program over and welcome Cordelia and John. John, over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. I really appreciate HSP for organizing this event and for involving Andalusia. We are thrilled to be joined by Cordelia Biddle and to be welcoming all of you from your homes to tonight's program. We are going to be discussing Cordelia's new book, Biddle, Jackson, and A Nation in Turmoil, and we will be taking some of your questions. But first, I wanted to share with all of you at home a little bit about Andalusia and its long history. Andalusia is located along the Delaware River in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. It's in Bucks County, just a couple miles north of the Philadelphia city limits. We are situated on a beautiful rise of land that overlooks the river and is surrounded by formal gardens and native woodlands. The centerpiece of the property is a mansion built 225 years ago in 1797 by a Philadelphia merchant named John Craig and his wife, Margaret Craig. Andalusia was originally a Federalist-style summer home with a porch that faced out over the river. In 1806, the architect Benjamin Latrobe added a pair of dependency structures to the back of the house, one for a kitchen, pulling it out of the basement, and the other for a study. But the major changes to the property would occur under the guidance of John Craig's daughter, Jane, and her husband, Nicholas Biddle, our subject of tonight's talk. In the 1830s, working with architect Thomas Walter, who would later go on to fame designing the dome of the Capitol, the Biddles transformed Andalusia into the distinctive Greek Revival home that it is today, with its massive columned portico facing the river. Under the portico, inside the house, Nicholas and Jane added massive new parlors for entertaining family and friends. They also added 2 long wings to the back of the house for more bedrooms, expanded kitchens, and a library. And it's from that library that we are joining you tonight. Andalusia remained a private family residence until 1980, when it was open to the public. Today, we offer guided tours of the home, which is a National Historic Landmark that has been carefully preserved and maintained over the years. We have an art collection on view throughout the house, as well as exhibition rooms that spotlight certain historical figures and collection areas. Outside the house, we have over 50 acres of gardens that visitors can freely explore from spring to summer and into the fall. The property includes several outbuildings, like the Grotto, a faux ruin in the French Gothic style that was another of the additions from the 1830s. Further back from the river, deeper into the gardens, is the walled garden. This was originally designed to cultivate table grapes in greenhouses that once lined the walls and were heated on the backside by coal furnaces. Today, visitors find a neatly manicured ilex hedge, wisteria vines, a really beautiful crabapple tree that blooms every spring, and more than 80 different kinds of roses. Finally, Andalusia, as of 2020, is a designated level 2 arboretum. We have over 1,000 trees on the property, and most of them are labeled for our visitors. Some trees are more than 100 years old and tower over the home and gardens. Right now, they're starting to come into their fall colors with yellow and gold and red. If you're interested in visiting Andalusia, I really encourage you to check out our website, which is andalusiapa.org. We are open from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, as well as certain Saturdays. The next Saturdays that we are open is October 29th and November 5th. And those days, of course, we're going to be highlighting the fall foliage around the property. After that, we close for the season, so I encourage you to visit while you can. We do remain open during the winter for private tours, and then we will reopen in April. But tonight, I'm here to talk with Cordelia and to talk about Nicholas Biddle, perhaps the most famous of the residents here at Andalusia, and to talk about all the work that she did for her new book. I want to begin by asking you to describe, and I know this could be the entire talk, but if you could describe for our visitors, for our guests tonight, who Nicholas Biddle was, just sort of give an overview of his life for us.
I will do that, John. And thank you very much for having me. And thank you for HSP to host this and to be in this wonderful library. I spent hours and hours in this library when I was researching Nicholas Biddle's life, and just to me, his soul is still in this place. All of his books are here. It's really phenomenal. So I urge you to visit. I urge you, probably don't take any books out with you, but do visit. It's an extraordinary spot. I have to have a cheat sheet because Nicholas Biddle did so much in his life that I did have to write an entire book. And it did take several years, and I don't want to do that tonight. So as you know, the family came here to the colony of New Jersey in 1681, and they were Quakers. And then they eventually came to Philadelphia. Nicholas Biddle was born in 1786. As we know, he was famed as a financier. But that wasn't his entire life. President of the Second Bank of the United States. But which he took over in 1823. But he was so many more things than that. He was really a Renaissance man. He was a polymath. He was a gifted orator. He was a presidential advisor. Probably he had a photographic memory. That is my interpretation of him. He was a child prodigy. He graduated from what is now Princeton University at the age of 15, the only person ever to do so. He helped translate the Louisiana Purchase while he was working as secretary to John Armstrong, who was the minister to France. He also met future President James Monroe when he was served as his secretary in London. And that draft correspondence, which is really wonderful, is right here at Andalusia, and shows an entirely different side of this man. The finished correspondence that is in the Library of Congress is interesting, but it doesn't allow you to really see who he was and how he was trying to impress his mentor. There are lines scratched out. He was clearly a young man saying, how do I best present myself? And so as an interpreter of history, that is just marvelous. But let me get back to his many accolades. He edited the journals of Lewis and Clark. He encouraged Thomas Jefferson to write the foreword. He edited the premier literary magazine of the era, Portfolio. John Quincy Adams was a contributor, as well as Benjamin Rush, who signed his name as Marcellus. So that was part of his literary career. If you think of a financier as being one thing and one thing only, he was not. He served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and he proposed a bill that would have allowed public education for children who were disadvantaged. That bill didn't come to fruition, but that was his bent. He was a populist, which is an interesting thing if you consider what he was born into and this house. And then he argued passionately and brilliantly in favor of maintaining Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States. He spoke for 3 hours with just a handful of notes. I couldn't do that to save my soul, but he was brilliant. And the charter didn't pass. The bank was abolished. As a result of that, when the War of 1812 occurred, the nation was nearly bankrupted because there was no national bank. Which brings me to the bank itself. As he had been a very close confidant to James Monroe, he helped James Monroe secure votes for the Louisiana Purchase, in favor of the Louisiana Purchase. Monroe needed him to help with the bank, and he asked him if he could become a member of the bank. He then became its president, which led, of course, to his cataclysmic battle with Andrew Jackson. Jackson and Biddle were entirely different human beings. They came from entirely different backgrounds. It's fascinating to consider whether they might have run into one another in Philadelphia and how they might have greeted one another, but we all know who Jackson was. He prided himself on being this rough-hewn frontiersman, and Biddle spoke many languages. He was erudite, he was cultured, he was very proud of all of that. And then you look at this partisan politics that grew out of this bank situation that had actually happened. I know I'm giving you an awful lot of information, but it's all there in the book. So if you get confused, you can go back and read it. But in 1828, when John Quincy Adams was in a battle for the presidency with Andrew Jackson. Jackson won the popular vote, but because there had been 4 candidates, the United States, under the 12th Amendment, gave they gave the presidency to Adams, which obviously infuriated Jackson and his followers, who had already been attacking Jackson. Jackson's followers had been attacking Adams' followers at the polls. They had been physically attacking one another. So this is the beginning of this really partisan politics. The nation was so divided that it seemed as if it was about to implode. And I read all the newspapers of the time. Not only did I do my research at HSP with Biddle letters, but read the newspapers of the era that are at the Philadelphia Library Company. And they gave this impression of a nation about to just implode. And so there I was in the middle of this. I was also doing the research when Trump was president. And so I then had a stronger sense of what happens when a nation is so polarized politically. I knew about Jackson. I knew about who he was as a man. I knew about why he was unpopular with some people, why he was popular with other voters. But I didn't understand really how a nation could almost come to its knees because of partisan politics. That's part of the story. Then there's also Biddle's private life, which was his marriage to Jane, who was a quiet woman who loved music. And that's part of another end of the story. It's another way of digging into his personality. And then I'll just end this with this. I also believe that he was acting as a confidential agent for the United States when he was traveling through Europe in 1804 to 1807. And I read his journals in their entirety, which are in the HSP, and they had been misfiled. And there was the file folder, and I dutifully asked to see what was in the file folder, and they contained nothing. So it took some sleuthing around, and lo and behold, I found them. And he traversed Europe, as I said, 1804 to 1807. For those of you who really know your European history, height of the Napoleonic Wars. He never mentioned Napoleon. He didn't mention Napoleon until he got to Greece and was, quote, free from the noisy cannonades of Europe. And at that point, he felt that he could write about Napoleon, and that he could make reference to the war. Otherwise, he clearly felt that his journals were going to be examined as he was crossing from one country into another. He was going across borders, and he was, as I would imagine it, really seeing the destruction of Napoleon's armies and the different battles. He also came home, and instead of going to meet his parents at the Lazaretto in Philadelphia, he journeyed to Washington with Jefferson, which lends credence to the theory that he was doing something more than just traversing the world as a young man. But if you look at this portrait later, very Byron-esque figure. So it's really quite easy to imagine him traveling through Europe and saying, oh, I'm just a young man out to explore the world and learn about art and culture. That's him in a nutshell. I could go on, but I think I should.
Well, thank you, Cordelia. I do love that element of your book, how you bring in this theory, this idea that he may have had ulterior motives for his journeys around Europe. And I do think particularly that trip to see Jefferson, rather than coming home to his family, who was waiting and expecting him.
Yes, absolutely.
Really sort of helps make your point. And
Well,
I think,
they didn't know, but then they wrote to him and said, we understand why you've done this, because obviously he couldn't let them know beforehand. We understand you're doing this for the betterment of your country. So
exactly.
they knew what he was doing.
So that angle to Biddle, what you discussed about his home life with Jane, which is something that I'm often thinking about here. And then also that relationship with Jackson. There's lots of different inroads. I'm curious how you, before you got to that and before you started thinking about the different ways that you might approach and dissect this important figure, I mean, what brought you to him in the first place? You're a writer, you've written a lot, but what made you want to tackle him?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it's because I didn't know anything about him. I knew he was a financier. I knew he was a brilliant financier and he was famous, and that he had been lauded in Europe, but I didn't know anything about him personally. And I think that's always what drives a writer. Who was this man? What motivated him? What were his fears? What were his hopes? And he came from a family of heroes. He was named after an uncle who had died during the Revolutionary War. There is a ship in the US Navy named after him. And so if you're a very erudite child and you're named after a war hero, and your uncle and your father all fought in the Revolutionary Wars, and your brothers are all officers, then who are you? And you go off to Princeton and you're kind of a nerdy kid who wants to live the life of the mind. That to me opened up a way of looking at him rather than saying, okay, financier, got it, and let's just crunch the numbers, because that was not interesting to me. I wanted to know who he was. And I have something to share with you. I will put on my glasses so I can read it, because this was a speech that he delivered at the opening of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. As I mentioned, he was an unlikely populist. He believed in infrastructure, and he believed that infrastructure would bring people together. So this is what he said. This is excerpted from quite a long speech. I will not give you the whole thing. Quote, while men are insulated at remote distances, their views are readily misconstrued, their interests misunderstood, and differences of opinion at first easily explicable ripen into causes for deep hostility. It is thus that national prejudices spring up for want of knowledge and become hereditary for want of intercourse. All these disappear when men come to approach and understand each other. I think that to me is the quintessence of who he was. He could not understand how politics could drive the country apart. He believed that banking was a universal benefit, boon to not only the wealthy, but to the struggling. So he saw this as a way of joining people together. If you are a farmer, you need to borrow money in order to plant your crops. You need to bring it to market. And so he saw this not as the central bank, not as a polarizing force, but as a unifying force. And I think that very fact that Andrew Jackson mistrusted the idea of a central bank, and that all of the people who did mistrust it and felt that that was big government versus the common man, if you will, that ended up being more of a partisan situation and choice. And he couldn't understand that. And I think that's why his battle with Jackson was so deeply wounding to him, because he felt he was right. And yes, he had hubris. And yes, he probably did things he shouldn't have done. But he felt that Jackson was altogether in the wrong. And Thomas Jefferson had disagreed with him and felt that Jackson was the most dangerous man he knew and unfit for the office. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. No, it does. And I do think that that sense of optimism or hope or idea that you could somehow create a unifying institution or a unifying sort of ethos is something that it runs through the book and reading elsewhere about Nicholas. And I think it also sort of is part of the concept or the principle of Andalusia itself as this home that has these gardens that were rigorously planned, and that it had a vision and sort of a life of its own. And I think he imagined that the bank could sort of be this beneficial entity.
Absolutely, absolutely, he did. And as we know, this was his retreat. This was his solace. This was Jane's idea of heaven on earth, and it actually is heaven on earth. But he was a very social man when he lived in Philadelphia. He loved to entertain. Jane was much more retiring. So this was a place that he could come and rejuvenate. And the fact that he was really quite well revered in Europe for his skills as a banker and for his skills at understanding how the financial system worked. And when he became president, the first thing he did was to create rules, because the Second Bank of the United States had almost fallen apart due to corruption. Nobody really had any sense of how the laws of banking should work, and board members of different banks were just filling their own pockets. So Biddle came in and said, we have to change this. We're going to put some practices, best practices into place. But then he was able to come back to Andalusia. And as you said, he took his practical knowledge and his practical approach and used it here in terms of how to build this space and his gardens. He also had another side to him that was, he loved to write rhyming couplets, and they are embarrassing, really. They are, but he loved it. And he then also decided he'd write a novel. And if you read that, it's like anybody's first novel. Oh, there's the wife who is sort of retiring, and her mother is very forceful and wonderful. And there's the brother who's, you just say, oh, Nicholas, this is embarrassing. I'm sorry you kept it. But he did.
Well, let's talk about your novels and not Nicholas's.
Well, okay.
And your historical writing. I'm curious for this book, as well as past books you've worked on, how do you go about doing your research? Because I know that a lot of people who are listening and tuning in tonight, they might be interested in HSP because they do research of their own, or maybe they're thinking it might be something they want to do, and they just sort of need that nudge. So for this book on Biddle, and for other historical work that you do, can you talk a little bit about your research process, maybe where it begins, what you look for, things like that?
I have no kind of beginning and an end. I jump in because I don't know something, and I say, how did this work? Who was this person? In my series that's set in Philadelphia in the 1840s, I didn't know anything about that era. We know about the Revolutionary War. We know about the Civil War. I didn't know what happened in that time. And so I began to discover race riots, and I discovered the position of women, the chasm between wealth and poverty. And I fell down so many research rabbit holes. I love doing research, and I love discovering how people lived. If you look at even Nicholas Biddle's era, right now, you could be, if you are watching this live streaming, you could be watching the Phillies game, and tomorrow you could see banner headlines, whether the Phillies win or lose. In Nicholas Biddle's time, there were poems by Virgil on the front page. So it was a different era, as you can imagine. So that's what I love. I love to just make those discoveries and make those connections. And in writing Biddle, I felt that I was channeling him. I felt that when I was writing about Catherine Drexel. I really wanted to know who she was. Very wealthy young woman. What made her decide to give up everything to educate people whom the US government had ignored, denied, abused, killed? So what happens? How does that work? And that research, whether it was at the library company for the newspapers, which are, I recommend that, or at HSP, reading all of the letters and the journals and delving into that. If you read Jane Craig's journal, which is at HSP, you really understand who this woman was and why, what motivated her and why. What were her delights? What were her sorrows? That to me is not just bringing history to life. It's allowing me to go back and finding communality with other eras, and finding this connection that we're all somehow together. When I was finishing my work on Nicholas Biddle, one of the objects that I hadn't yet seen was a scrapbook that he was creating, and he died while he was creating it. And it hadn't been opened, I don't think, until I opened it. It had been put away after he died and wrapped up and twine wrapped around it. And so I was able to look at it and see what he glued onto the pages, how he glued them on. They were not rigid and straight. They were sloppy. And so I saw him as a man in failing health, and certainly the bank war, it hurt him deeply. And I think it really broke his heart. But to see that and say, this was my ancestor. This could have been my grandfather, could have been my great-grandfather. It goes back further than that. But I had this sense of him as a person who was sorrowing and who was trying to make sense of his life and present to his heirs. These were the speeches that I gave, and I was so proud of this one. And this was, I appeared in this newspaper, and then all of a sudden the pages stopped, and I realized that he was dead. And of course, you can't fall down and weep when you're looking at archival, any archival artifact. You would ruin it. So I had to get up and walk around and then snuffle quietly off to myself, but it was heartrending. I hope that answers your question. I think I've just gone on.
No, and you know, we're just talking here, so I can't help but recall an experience I had at HSP this summer where I wanted to explore the John and Margaret Craig papers. So that is the parents of Nicholas's wife, Jane Craig, and the people who first built Andalusia. And there were some little memo books and account books, and some of them are tiny, about this tall, maybe 3 or 4 inches tall, and maybe 2 inches wide. And you know, just like the tiniest little notebook, and just the size of it makes you think about where they kept it, right? Like they're in their pockets, in a waistcoat, and that it was probably something they always had on them because it was really easy to carry around. And that physical quality of it is something that first impressed me. But then as I was, you know, I was going to say thumbing through it, but I was much more carefully leafing through it. I came across this one note that said, I forget the exact date, but I think maybe it was October 1811. Jane and Nicholas Biddle married today at Andalusia, and they mention 3 or 4 people who are in attendance, and then it says they're headed to Baltimore in a coach, and that was it. You know, it was 1 page on a piece of paper, no more than 3 or 4 inches and 2 inches wide, and just like a little account of the day. And there was something so heart-wrenching in the other sense of the word from what you described. You know, it was real.
And then
Yeah.
Margaret Craig wrote in that same journal, or one of them, when her husband died, she wrote, today I have been left a wretched widow. And so you read that and it's succinct. She had beautiful handwriting. Nicholas Biddle had terrible handwriting, I must say. Trying to decipher his letters it was difficult. And when he was happy, his writing slanted upwards. And when he was troubled, his handwriting slanted downwards. But there were times that I actually had to take the letters and turn them upside down to see if I could understand what he was really trying to say.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think that adds a sort of an element or a texture to one's understanding of history. You know, as David mentioned in the introduction, I don't come to what I'm doing now through a study of history, through a study of archives primarily. I come to it with an art history background. And a lot of what you're doing when you're thinking about art is sort of the unspoken ways that ideas or emotions might come through. And that could be in a painting, but that could also be in handwriting, right? Or where on the sheet of paper someone decides to make some little marginalia notes. And we try to read into these things. We might never be able to. We might never know exactly what someone was thinking or what their intentions were, but approaching it in many ways.
Well,
Do you disagree?
Well, I do disagree, because I think if you spend enough time with your subject, which I did, if you are working on this for almost 5 years, you get to know them so well that you begin to have this sense of educated conjecture. So you know the person, you know the era, you know what they were battling or what they were hoping for. And so then you begin to interpret, just as you would of a dear friend or a relative or a parent. And you say, okay, I know that's not exactly what I'm seeing here, but I think that's what you really need. So it's really that almost that sense of coming back to the fact that I think he was a confidential agent. What else was he doing? Who was he?
Yeah. So once you do your research, well, one question, do you conclude your research and then start writing, or do they sort of, they overlap?
They overlap, absolutely. Because you don't know, you discover something as you're doing your research and you say, I had no idea that Margaret Craig was a flirt, and she was, and beautiful, and she loved to dress well, and she was always in despair that Jane didn't have her same flair with costumes and design and so forth. So you know, you learn that, and then you say, oh, I have to go and add that in. Then you learn a little bit more about Jane, you learn more about Nicholas, you learn that the great comet of 1811 passed over this house, and then you say, oh, but Napoleon thought that was something that had to do with his successes. And I thought,
Of course he would.
yes, of course he would. But then you all of a sudden you're bringing in all different elements into the book, so you have to do it. I think it would be really awful to try to do all the research. It would be the book would be so cold, it wouldn't have no life to it.
But when do you
Think enough is enough?
yeah, when do you stop, and when do you,
never
right,
do.
because the book is published, you're
I
not going to
know.
add to it.
I
So
know.
how do you sort of know when to wrap it up?
Well, if I found more on Nicholas Biddle, I wouldn't be able to add to this, but I certainly would I wouldn't say, that's done, I'm finished. The book is out there and I'll just move on to something else. I would find it still fascinating. Are there more journals that never appeared? Is there something else that I didn't discover? Because if we think about the first book that was written about Nicholas Biddle, it was published in, I just want to say 52 by Thomas Gilvan. He didn't know anything about those Monroe letters.
Right.
Those are a recent gift to Andalusia. And so all he had was the bank. And he couldn't say, here's a man who's advising Monroe, and why is he advising Monroe, and what is their relationship? And it was such a close relationship that Biddle, in his letters to Monroe, that in the Library of Congress, it just says, pursuant to our last communication, I agree. The letters that are upstairs here have much more information. They refer to a secret treaty between the United States and Spain that eventually was ratified, and Biddle was part of that because he knew one of the players in that treaty. So it never goes away.
Of course, yeah. No, I can see the passion, and it's what makes the book so wonderful, and why we're so happy to have you here. I have one more question before we open things up to questions from our audience, and it'll sort of segue into that because I'm curious what advice you might have for people who are looking to research their family or other historical figures, advice on the research process or on the writing process. Anything that you might have to offer before we take questions?
I would just say, never give up. Keep going. Don't feel that I've found everything and I can now write it. And really let yourself conjure that person. Let yourself feel that that person is part of you, because that person is, and especially if it's a family member. And don't say, oh, I can't corroborate that, because I can't say for certain that he was a confidential agent, but everything leads me to believe he was. And so why not throw it out there as a question to the readers and say, could this have been true? Could it not have been true? And so just keep going, and don't be dismayed if it takes years.
Yeah, and I want
to will.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. I think you've been fortunate enough to be able to publish a book on this, but anything that you can write or any way that you can commemorate the history of someone, whether it's a family member or someone else, can be beneficial to future generations
Absolutely.
of scholars. I have definitely relied on a variety of sources, from short little articles to website blogs and things like that maybe they don't give me the definitive answer, the definitive story on something, but it's part of one little breadcrumb in the trail of discovering something.
And maybe there is no definitive answer, and that's the wonderful part of it, is that it is conjecture, but it is sort of scholarly conjecture.
Right.
So that you leave yourself always with that question, that what if. Because I think what if is what drives me as a novelist, and what if is what drives me as a writer of nonfiction as well.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear a third voice from our colleague Justina, who is on the boards today and is covering the camera and the monitors for us, as well as the lighting and sound. So thank you to Justina for making this possible. And we're going to hear her voice as she reads off some questions from our audience tonight.
Great, thank you, friends. We do have a number of questions, and one of these segues beautifully with what you were just talking about, Cordelia. Michael asks, I have a question about your choice of third-person narrative viewpoint when you're using artifacts from objects, documents from Nicholas's writing. Did you consider ever creating more dialogue for your characters and therefore making the story more fictional? He says, I struggle with this choice with my own ancestral work, fictionalizing the life of Matthew Carey, and his siblings.
No, I didn't, because I really felt that this needed to be scholarly, and My novels are different, and when I teach, if my students want to take on one of the courses I teach is writing history. And so I encourage them, if they want to write in first person, so they can really get to know who this person was that they're chronicling. But I felt that that was doing a disservice to Nicholas Biddle to make him into something that was fictionalized. I wanted to do that scholarly research and then look at all of the era around him, surrounding him. So it wasn't just him reacting to Jackson or to anything that was going on in Washington. When loaded pistols were taken into the Senate chamber, that I think it would have been a mistake to do that in first person. So that's my advice for this, but that's not my advice for everybody.
It's good to have you as a writer, Cordelia, and a historian. This is another historian question. Frances asks, understanding that the bank war was forced on Nicholas, did he make any mistakes in the bank war and the effort to recharter the bank? So what mistakes do you see?
I think his biggest mistake was his hubris. He didn't feel that Andrew Jackson could defeat him. He thought, I know what I'm doing. I know what banking is. I know how it works. I know how it works in Europe, and I know how it should work here. And this man knows nothing. And he was bankrupt, and he had been bankrupt. And so I think really it was his personality that got in his way, because he thought that he could defeat a sitting president, and he couldn't.
Yeah, and that it would be the merits of the bank would be judged on the merits of the bank alone, rather than the political discourse and arguments that were really built around it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think this question might be for both of you. I'll throw it out there. We can chit chat back and forth. Did he get his money from banking and finance, or did he inherit it, or both? So where did he come into the money, or did he marry into it?
Yeah, so both, as mentioned, where we are sitting now, Andalusia was built by John and Margaret Craig, and their only daughter, Jane, marries Nicholas in 1811. Nicholas also comes from a relatively well-off family, although it had its own history of financial ups and downs. So his father had done very well as a merchant, and he served in the Merchant Navy during the Revolutionary War. He was a political figure in Pennsylvania state legislature. But his father, William Biddle III, died in early age after having bankrupted the family. And this is after two previous generations of relatively successful family members. So there is immediate wealth, which then Nicholas builds on top of with his, he was a prodigy, as Cordelia described. So his literary work, the editing that he does for the portfolio, for the Lewis and Clark journals, his role in banking as well. He practices law briefly, and then also through his marriage as well. So, no one is self-made, but he, there are always influences that shape a person. And in Nicholas's case, he had, some of his own determination, as well as the benefit of the privilege that he was born into. And then that privilege, I think, is really what probably allowed for his marriage to Jane Craig, which, then helped, consolidate and further their wealth a little bit more. By the end of his life, the tide had turned, another up had turned to a down. There is not much money in the family. Jane lives several years after Nicholas dies in 44. The Andalusia property is willed to the surviving siblings, who sort of take joint care of it. And it's maintained for a number of decades in something of a static manner compared to the massive building expansions that Nicholas and Jane oversaw. So the history of the property in some ways echoes some of the story of the prosperity of the family as well.
And just to add to that, when Nicholas and Jane were married in 1811, this is when Biddle was really on a roll as a state legislator. And so for Margaret Craig, this was a wonderful up and coming leader of a political party for her daughter to marry. So I think there was a sense of he was a catch.
Definitely. And yeah, he was very charismatic. And all the things that Cordelia described at the beginning of our talk, up until the portion about his work with the bank. So the diplomatic work, his time in Europe, his schooling, of course, his editorial work and his literary work, and his political work, that's all before the age of 30. So at the time that he is, his most eligible, and he wasn't bad looking. So
oh, there's a portrait of him when he was in Europe. Honestly, it's might as well be Byron.
Yeah. Another question?
Is that an original Thomas Sully?
Oh, yes, this is an original Thomas Sully. If we had another easel, we would have brought out the Thomas Sully portrait of Jane Craig as well. There are a few paintings by Thomas Sully here in the house, including a great one that we acquired at auction earlier this year in May from a descendant of the family. It had left Andalusia and we were able to purchase it and bring it back here. It was a portrait of his brother, Commodore James Biddle, that Nicholas had commissioned. I think his brother did not want the portrait done, perhaps, and Nicholas said, well, you really ought to. But no, he was definitely a favorite painter of many Philadelphia elites and definitely of the Biddle
Jane
family.
constantly tried to she was trying to play matchmaker for her brother-in-law. That's a whole other story. Won't go into that.
We have two more questions, and I think these kind of pull the personal into the broader historical context that we were talking about earlier. Oliver asks, after studying Biddle, do you have a sense that the Bank War was a turning point in the culture of America's early establishment families? Do you see any evidence that subsequent generations began to shy away from public service, political service specifically?
That's a fascinating question, and I had never considered it, but I think you have a really good point that probably was the case, because Biddle, as we know, was pilloried. And if you look at the original newspapers, you see all the political cartoons of the time. Biddle is made a mockery of. They're very disturbing images. Jackson at one point is also put on a roasting spit. And so for Biddle, who was not, in fact, a politician, who really did this because he felt that it was the right thing to do, this was a terrible blow. And I think that's a good point of what happens then afterwards to other families. Do they retreat? Do they go forward again? Do they say, yes, but this nation must be rescued and we can't allow this partisan politics to occur? I don't know. I think that's something I'm going to have to ponder, but I think it's a very interesting observation.
Thank you. And somewhat of a follow-up question. Walter's asking, where do you think your work fits on the Bank Wars with prior scholarship? So extensive prior scholarship.
That my sense is that I was really looking at Nicholas Biddle as a human being, and the Bank Wars had to do more with the personal attacks on one person to another, In Washington, one senator attacking another, Thomas Hart Benton, as I mentioned, bringing loaded pistols into the Senate chamber. So I was more interested in that than the inner workings of finance. So I'm not sure where my work then falls in terms of other people looking at the banking system, because I was much more interested in the personalities. I was riveted to them. I would come home from HSP and just start blithering in my poor husband and to listen to me every night at dinner. Poor guy.
Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank you both. I'm going to kick it back to you to say the final thank yous. Thank you, everyone who has joined us. We hope to see you again at future HSP programs. But Cordelia and John, thank you.
No,
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. It's been wonderful to be able to share this amazing room with everybody. I wish you were all with us, actually. When we were setting it up, I felt that somehow we were little kids who were visiting Nicholas Biddle and saying, we can bring technology into this house.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of the house. And definitely, if you haven't visited before, or if it's been a long time since you visited, come by, say hi. We've got some wonderful guides who do great tours of the house. And the trees just look beautiful, and there's still a little more interest in the gardens before it's starting to get cold. So thank you to HSP again. Thank you, Cordelia, for being such a great conversationist. And good night.
Good night. Thank you.